Safe from the reaper, not a saint nor a sinner. Rage under my skin, slowly descend into madness. Let it spread like a virus. Be a friend with the virus.
Hello everybody and welcome to today's video in which I review The Bleeding by Johanna Gustawwson. This is translated from the French to English by David Warner and I absolutely adored this story. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. We are following 3 women across 3 eras, focusing on this quite dark and gritty mystery that seems to be hanging over them all like a curse. This could be described as historical fiction, thriller, fantasy, horror, crime, mystery. It falls into so many categories and genres, but at the same time, it's entirely its own thing. So a little bit more about the story itself. Our 3 perspectives are, again, across different times, following Maxine, Lena, and Lucienne. The back does it better. It breaks down each kind of perspective a little bit more, just so you know what you're going into for each character study, I guess you could say. So do excuse me whilst I quickly read you the back, because honestly, I'm going to be stumbling over my words otherwise. The chapters focused on Lucienne is set in 1899, Belle Epoque Paris. Lucienne's 2 young daughters are believed to be dead when her mansion burns to the ground. However, Lucienne is certain that her daughters live still, and so she embarks on a journey into the occult to get her answers. During post-war Quebec in 1949 is where we meet Lena. Her father has died in the French Resistance. She is really struggling with bullies at school and she's not really getting the support that she's seeking from her mother. However, when she's introduced to an elderly woman at the asylum that her mother works in, her life changes around for the better, absolutely irresistibly, you might say, as she stumbles on a dark path to gain power over herself and others. And finally, our present day narrative is actually set in 2002, Quebec, and we're following Maxine. Is a police officer just coming back from maternity leave and bereavement leave, and she's brought on to quite a troubling case where her former school teacher has brutally stabbed, thus murdering her husband. She is single-handedly parenting a teenager and a baby, whilst also taking on this increasingly perplexing investigation. The last section here says, under enormous personal pressure, Maxine makes a series of macabre discoveries that link directly to historical cases involving black magic and murder, secret societies and spiritism, and women at breaking point who will go to terrifying lengths to protect the ones they love. This is actually the 3rd out of 4 books that I had on my 5-star predictions list for the summer, and I'm so glad that it actually exceeded my expectations. Of course, I gave it the 5 stars that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, but my experience reading this book was so much more elevated than I'd anticipated going in. I'm definitely going to have to keep an eye out on more translations from this author, because this just took me away. I was completely hooked from the depth of the storytelling and the complexity, duality and captivation of the characters from the beginning, which is interesting really, because sometimes I say quite a lot I struggle with unlikable characters, so I guess that is something that I seek to connect with when I'm reading a story, especially if the story for me is falling flat, which this isn't the case, just an example I'm pulling from my head here. But when we have a dislikable character, characters are my thing that I crave to, that I sort of parasocially attached to, and when I have a dislikable one, that kind of goes out the window. However, despite that being the case, I couldn't help but feel absolutely connected to each and every one of them, to see how their story would grow and ultimately spiral into this dark abyss of sometimes psychosis, sometimes just pure human evils, and just the depths of depravity that humans can go through. It was fascinating and it made for a far more entertaining read, and not even a connection to the characters, because obviously I don't connect to that on a personal level, but just an investment, I guess you could say, in how the story would develop through them. David Warner did a fantastic translation. I would just like to quickly mention that note. I honestly, if I didn't know from the beginning pages that it was translated from the French, I would have been none the wiser, because the way this flowed was just beautifully, and it honestly felt that it was originally written in English. I hadn't any inkling that it was otherwise. So yeah, I think obviously the way it was originally written helped loan itself to be translated so beautifully. But as a translator, artist, David really kind of did great work here, kind of mirroring and blending and just creating good connections between words and such to create such a authentic experience for an English reader. So I appreciate that the writing was beautifully done. Each of the women in this story, as I say, Maxine, Lucienne and Lena, each had very distinctive voices, and each time I was reading from a particular perspective, I would think, oh, this is it, this is my favorite, this is where the story is really going to take off, this is the one to watch. And then I would flip to another perspective and feel exactly the same, drawing on the fact that they all had kind of unlikable characteristics, some more so than others, and you know, feeling that investment so earnestly for all of them is such a display of genuinely fantastic writing, I think, on our author's behalf. I found them to be so believable in their creation, really, their lack of values, the way they set themselves up for their story. You know, I think the fact that they all had their struggles, yet this kind of desperation and determination to strive for something more, whether for themselves or for loved ones, that spark itself really had me intrigued to see how that would connect throughout the other characters' lives, how they were connected, because it wasn't in my head, the original kind of familial connections that I was expecting. I went into this thinking it may be more of a matriarchal generational story, but they're not really related in that way. So it was interesting to see how threads would be tied and, you know, cut and then woven again into each other to see how they blend and, you know, interconnect, I suppose. There was a main theme in this of witchcraft, and I thought it was so well done. I had so much fun exploring that as a concept, as a theme, and just seeing how deeply rooted a lot of the conversations and themes were within some of our characters, and how it led them to some of the decisions that they made. You know, it was a difficult, dark read a lot of the time with some of the things that were happening in the story, but the way the story developed from the, you know, the fork in the road, which direction did they choose, what did fate have in store for our characters, was absolutely fascinating. And again, it kept me so enthralled from the get-go. Again, mainly pertaining to witchcraft, I particularly loved this segment where we were getting kind of advice and just some history, some context from a local priest to help solve a case, because remembering we are kind of at the heart of it, trying to solve a mystery of this murder, finding out why this was done, if the school teacher really did this, what her motives were. And in doing that, there was a lot of unearthing in this present day monologue during the chapters of Maxine, where a lot of dark occultist, spiritualist, but mainly pertaining to Satanism imagery and literature was found. And going to the priest was interesting in terms of the direction that they went with it. It didn't feel like bigoted or completely like washed away as something sinful. He looked at it more in a scholarly way, which I found to be such a breath of fresh air approach to it from a religious perspective. And he sort of broke down what these famous satanic paintings were all about, what some of the imagery could give and what it could mean within relation to the case, why she might have had these. And it was fascinating. I felt like I was learning so much about these illustrations and these art pieces and these pieces of text, and it just felt like almost in a way to just get the context of information down on the page, but it was done in a clever way, I feel, especially from, again, a perspective of a holy man coming like completely unjudgmentally, completely without a bias, just putting out some factual information about the context and the history behind these pieces. And I really enjoyed that. That was one of my favourite things. It felt like a history lesson, and yeah, it fascinated me to no end. I really loved that our main characters all in some way ended up flirting with this darker side of life and kind of treading the path of the unholy. Originally in a way just to stand up for themselves, to seek a little bit of power, but of course it always came from some sort of twisted, corrupted aspect, you know. Something was feeding on a darker part of themselves and it ballooned into something far worse. The exploration of this storyline, told in three completely different ways at that, yet being so well spliced together over the eras, was delivered so thoughtfully and so well. And just to wrap it up by saying, really, the last 5-ish chapters, just when I thought that the story was winding down, we were getting our conclusion, and I was kind of feeling satisfied by the approach of the end, turns upon turns upon turns. And it surprised me because up until then, we'd pretty much had this whole dark void of the spiritualist movement, so the darker aspects of it, the darker occult. That was our thriller aspect. That was kind of what our story was steeped in. But then these spins kind of felt very much domestic thriller in its approach, and it just felt completely different to the tradition of the story before them, but in a good way. And it just completely blew me out of field. I was not expecting any of what happened in the last couple of chapters to happen, and I was shocked, I was disgusted, I was a bit confused, but overall I thought it was a fantastic story, and I think it's one I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. So yes, that is my review for The Bleeding by Johanna Gustawwson. I don't think I got my thoughts across as eloquently as I'd hoped, but if I have failed to do that for you, I of course do have my good reason Storygraph reviews written already, and you can always find those in the description if you are interested. But for now, do let me know if you yourself have read this book, if you've read any other books by this author that you might recommend, or any other books that come to mind that sound similar to this in tone, in theme, that sort of thing that you think I might like. Do let me know. I love recommendations. But yes, for now, I shall thank you very much for watching this video, and I shall speak to you in another video soon. Bye!